Every winter, for 11 years, old Halvor Nagel hitched his sled and hauled a load of firewood out to an empty hill 4 miles from his farm, in the worst weather of the year, and dumped it there, on ground he did not own, where nothing stood and no one lived, and then turned around and drove home. He never told a soul why. And when we finally followed his sled tracks out to that hill, in the spring of 1901, 3 weeks after we buried him, what we found there answered a question none of us had ever thought to ask, and left us ashamed of every easy thing we had believed about a strange old man for 20 years. My name is Soren Nagel, and Halvor was my uncle, and I am the one who followed the tracks, so it falls to me to tell what was at the end of them. I was a boy when it started, and a grown man when it ended, and in between I did what the whole of Red Wing Township did, which was to decide that my uncle was a harmless lunatic, and leave it at that. I have spent the rest of my life trying to make up for how little it cost me to think so. You have to understand the kind of man he was, or the mystery makes no sense, and neither does the answer. Halvor Nagel came to the Dakota Prairie from Norway as a young man with his brother, my father, and the two of them took neighboring quarters on the open, flat land east of the Cheyenne, in a country that was beautiful in summer and tried to kill you every winter. My father married and had me and filled his house with noise. Halvor never married. He built a good, tight house and a good, tight barn, and he farmed as well as any man in the township, and he kept to himself so completely that keeping to himself became the only thing anyone knew about him. He was not unfriendly. He was simply closed, the way some men go closed around a thing they have decided never to speak of. And the township, which likes a man it can read, gave up trying to read Halvor Nagel early and settled for laughing at him instead. There was plenty to laugh at if you wanted to laugh, and Red Wing wanted to. He talked to his horses more than to people. He kept his yard swept like a church floor. And every winter, in the deep of it, when any sensible man stayed close to his own stove, Halvor Nagel loaded his sled with good split firewood, wood he had cut and dried himself, and drove it 4 miles out to a low, bare hill on the section line, a hill nobody owned and nobody farmed, and nobody had any reason to go to, and he stacked that wood in the lee of the hill and drove home empty. Nobody could make sense of it. The wood just sat there. Come spring, some of it would be gone, and folks said tramps must be burning it, or Indians, and Halvor never said yes or no. The next winter he would haul more. The township named it, the way it named everything it could not understand. Nagel's Folly, they called the hill, and they told the story of the crazy Norwegian who hauled firewood to nowhere, at the store and the church and the school, and it became one of those local jokes that a place keeps polished for years, and I heard it my whole childhood, and I laughed too, God help me, because he was my own uncle, and I was young, and it is easy to laugh at what you have not troubled to understand. I want to tell you the one thing I knew about him that the township did not, because I was his blood, and I spent time in his house that others did not, and then I will let it wait until the end, where it belongs. On the wall of Halvor Nagel's front room, by the door, where every day of his life he would see it going out and coming in, hung a woman's shawl. It was old and finely made, blue with a border of white, a Norwegian shawl, a young woman's shawl, and it was not my mother's, and it was not anything he ever explained. It hung on that nail for 20 years. I asked him about it once, when I was small, and he looked at it a long moment and said only, "She was cold." And he never said another word about it, then or ever, and I was too young to know that I had been told everything and nothing in 3 words. The winters on that prairie were the true rulers of the country, and you cannot understand what Halvor was doing without understanding them. So let me tell you plainly what a Dakota blizzard was. It was not snow, it was a wall. It came down out of the northwest with no warning a careless man would heed, and it turned the air to a roaring whiteness in which a person could not see his own hands, and it did not stop for a day or 2 days or 3. And the particular horror of it, the thing that killed people who were not fools, was how it caught them on the road. A man would set out for town on a clear morning, or a family would start home from a neighbor's, or a child would leave the schoolhouse, and the storm would come down between them and their door, and they would be lost in a white, roaring nothing, with no way to tell north from south, and they would freeze within a mile of shelter they could not find. That is how the prairie killed, not in the house, but on the way to it. It killed the traveler caught between one safe place and the next, with no third place to run to. And there, though it took us 20 years and a dead man's sled tracks to see it, was the whole answer to Nagel's folly, hidden in plain sight the entire time. But I am ahead of myself, and this is a story that must be told in the order I learned it, because the order is the whole of it. For all those years, I knew only what the township knew. My uncle hauled wood to a hill for no reason, and was strange, and was alone, and grew old. I went to see him more than most, because my father asked it of me after his own health failed, and I would sit in that swept, quiet house with the blue shawl on the wall, and try to make conversation with a man who answered in as few words as courtesy allowed. And I will be honest and tell you I went out of duty and not out of love, because I did not know him well enough to love him, because he would not be known. I thought there was nothing to know. I thought the wood on the hill was the delusion of a lonely old bachelor, and I pitied him for it in the lazy way you pity someone you have not bothered to understand. And that pity is the thing I have had to live with, and it is why I am telling you this now, so that at least the truth of him outlives the joke. The first crack in the joke came the winter I was grown, and I did not even recognize it as a crack at the time. There was a bad storm that year, a real killer, 3 days of it, and when it broke, word came around the township of who had been caught out and how they had fared. And an old woman named Mrs. Amundsen, who had been driving home alone from her daughters when the storm came down, told at the church how she had been lost and near frozen and certain she would die on the open prairie, when she came up against a hill in the whiteness, and in the lee of that hill she found a great stack of dry firewood and a tin box of matches wrapped in oilcloth wedged into the middle of it, and she had burned that wood for a day and a night until the storm passed, and it saved her life. And the township said, well, imagine that. The crazy Norwegian's woodpile finally did some good, and they chuckled at the luck of it, and moved on. Even then, hearing it, I did not understand. I thought it was an accident. I thought she had stumbled by chance on a lunatic's leavings. It did not once occur to me, or to anyone, that a sane man had put dry wood and dry matches on that hill on purpose, every year for a decade, and set them where a freezing traveler's hand would find them, because he had worked out something about that hill that none of the rest of us ever bothered to. I should have understood it then. I had every piece. I simply did not want to do the work of putting them together, because the easy story, the crazy old man story, asked nothing of me, and the true story, as I would learn, asked everything, and asked it too late. Halvor Nagel grew old the way such men do, quietly and without complaint, and in the winter of 1901, at 74 years of age, he did not answer his door when I drove out to check on him, and I found him gone in his bed, peaceful, his hands folded, the fire cold in the stove. He had died in the night, alone, as he had lived, and the blue shawl hung on the wall above him. We buried him in the Red Wing churchyard beside my father, and the township came, because a township comes, and stood in the cold and said the kind, vague things people say about a man they never troubled to know. And more than one of them, I heard it, called him by the old joke, even at his grave. There goes Nagel and his folly, they said. And I said nothing, because I still, even then, standing at his grave, did not understand that the joke was the noblest thing any of us had ever stood near. It was going through his house afterward that started to turn me, because his house, when you truly looked at it, was not the house of a crazy man. It was the house of the most careful man I have ever known. Everything in it was ordered and labeled and kept. His tools hung on pegs, each in its outline drawn on the wall, so he would know at a glance if one were missing. His accounts were squared to the penny in a ledger written in a fine, slow hand. His woodshed, when I looked at it with new eyes, held twice the wood one old man could burn in a winter, split fine and stacked to season, and I had walked past that shed 100 times and never once asked myself why a man alone cut wood for two. I began, that week, to do the thing I should have done 20 years before, which was to pay attention. I asked around the township, quietly, about the hill. Not as a joke this time, but as a question. And the answers came back different than the joke had ever let them come. Because when you ask a place seriously about a thing it is only ever laughed at, it stops laughing and starts remembering. An old freighter recalled a night he had been caught on the section line road years back and had given himself up for lost and had blundered against a hill in the dark and found wood and a means to light it and lived, and had never known till I asked him that the wood had a keeper. He had thought it was Providence. He was not far wrong. The schoolmaster remembered the Volk children coming to class the morning after a storm with a story no one had believed about a woodpile in the snow that had kept them through the night, and how their mother had lit a candle in church for a stranger she could not name. Piece by piece, asking the questions I had been too lazy and too comfortable to ask while the man was alive to answer them, I began to see that the hill was not a folly at all. It was a station. It had been saving people quietly for as long as it had stood, and the township had turned every rescue into a piece of luck, rather than admit that the man it mocked had known something it did not. And then, in a drawer of his writing table, under the ledger, I found a second book, bound in oilcloth, worn soft at the corners from handling, and it was that book that took the ground out from under 20 years of my certainty and left me standing in my dead uncle's house with my hat in my hands and tears on my face, for a man I had helped to mock. It was a record of the hill. That is the only way I can name it. In his slow, careful hand, going back 11 years, Halvor Nagel had written down every load of wood he ever hauled to that bare hill on the section line. The date he cut it, the date he hauled it, how much, where exactly he stacked it, in the lee of the north face, out of the worst wind, where he had reasoned a lost traveler would fetch up. He had noted the tin of matches renewed each fall, wrapped fresh in oilcloth against the damp. And down the margin, in a different ink, added over the years, were other entries, and these were the ones that broke me, because these were the names. He had written down, as he learned of them, the people the hill had saved. Mrs. Amundsen, the winter of '96. A hired man named Pearson, caught out in '98, who never knew whose wood he burned. 2 children of a family named Volk, lost coming from school in the storm of '99, who found the hill in the dark and lived. A peddler whose name he never got, who told the story in town of a miraculous woodpile and moved on. 7 souls in 11 years, written down small and plain in the margin of a book no one was ever meant to see, by a man who had saved every one of them on purpose, and let every one of them believe it was luck, and had never once, in church or store or schoolyard, said a word to claim it, though claiming it would have turned the whole township's laughter into praise in an afternoon. He let them laugh. He let them call it his folly. He knew what it was, and he wrote it in a book, and he told no one, because the saving was the thing, and the credit was nothing to him at all. Now I will tell you the plain sense of what my uncle had done, because it was not a whim, and it was not luck. It was as careful a piece of thinking as any engineer ever did, worked out alone by a quiet man who told no one his reasoning. He had understood the one thing about the prairie that killed people, which was that the blizzard killed the traveler caught between shelters, the person lost on the open ground, with no third place to run to. And he had looked at the country around his farm the way a man looks at a problem he means to solve. And he had found that hill, and here is why that hill. It sat on the section line, on the natural path between the town and the string of farms to the east, the very route a person would be traveling when a storm caught them. It stood up high enough to be a landmark a lost person might strike. Its north face threw a lee, where a fire could live in a wind that would tear a flame apart anywhere on the open flat. And it was almost exactly halfway along the deadliest stretch, the long 4-mile run with no house on it, where more than one person the township remembered had died within the years he had lived there. Halvor Nagel had looked at where people died, and he had built, with his own hands and his own wood, and 11 years of driving into the teeth of the weather nobody else would face, a third place. A place to run to. He had put shelter and fire in the one spot on the prairie where a freezing soul might reach it, and he had stocked it every single winter, whether it was used or not, because you cannot know in October which storm will catch which traveler. So you must simply have the wood there, always, waiting, for the year and the person you cannot predict. And now I will tell you the last of it, the thing I understood only when I carried that oilcloth book to the wall and stood beneath the blue shawl, because the shawl and the hill and the silence were all one thing, and had been all along, and I had been too dull and too comfortable to see it. My father told me, once, long before, a thing about his brother that I had heard as a child and filed away as old, sad history, with no bearing on the strange old man I knew. When Halvor was a young man, newly come to this country, he had been engaged to be married to a girl from a neighboring Norwegian family, and in the second winter, before the wedding, that girl had been caught out on the prairie in a blizzard, driving alone the short distance between her family's house and her sister's, a distance she had walked 100 times. And the storm had come down between her and the door, and there had been no third place for her to run to, no shelter on that open ground. And they had found her when it cleared, not half a mile from her sister's house, frozen, with her shawl wrapped around her against a cold no shawl could answer. She was cold. That is what he said to me once about the shawl on his wall. She was cold. And he took his grief, and instead of letting it close him into nothing, which is what we all assumed had happened, that a jilting or a loss had turned him strange, he had spent it, quietly, for the rest of his life, making certain that no other traveler caught the way she was caught, would die the way she died, for want of a third place to run to. He could not save her. She was 50 years dead. So every winter, for as long as his body would let him, he drove out into the same killing weather that took her, and he built on a bare hill 4 miles from his door, the shelter she never found, and he stocked it with warmth and with fire, and with the means to make it, and he told no one, and he saved 7 strangers in her name, and let them think it was luck, and he hung her shawl by his door, and looked at it every morning of his life, and we called it his folly. The wood was never for nothing. The wood was for her, and for everyone the prairie tried to take the way it took her, and my uncle Halvor Nagel was not the crazy Norwegian who hauled firewood to nowhere. He was the sanest and the kindest man in that whole township, and he was the only one of us who had ever looked hard enough at how people died to do something about it. And he did it alone, for 50 years, for love, and asked nothing, and got a joke for a monument. I followed his sled tracks out to the hill that spring, the last set he ever made, still faint in the melting snow, and I stood in the lee of the north face, where the wood was stacked, his last load dry and ready, with the tin of matches wrapped fresh in oilcloth for a winter he did not live to see. And I understood, standing there, that I was standing in a place my uncle had built out of the worst thing that ever happened to him, a good place, a saving place, and that he had built it in silence and would have gone on building it in silence forever if his heart had held. I sat down in the lee of that hill, a grown man, and I wept for him, and for the girl in the blue shawl, and for how cheaply I had held a man who was worth more than the whole laughing township put together. And I made him a promise there that I have kept. I did not let the joke be his monument. I told the township what was in the book, and I read them the names, the 7 they had all heard of and thought were luck, and I watched the laughter go out of Red Wing for good, and something better come into it, which was shame, and then understanding, and then, at last, honor. 50 years late, but real. We kept the woodpile. That is the thing I am proudest of in my life. The township took it up as its own, and every winter after, someone hauled dry wood and fresh matches out to Nagel's Hill and stocked the lee of the north face, and we built a small, stout shelter there in time, a proper one, with a stove, and we never called it Nagel's Folly again. We called it Nagel's Hill, and then just the shelter, and travelers used it for 40 years until the roads and the automobiles made it a thing of the past, and I do not know how many more it saved, because we went on keeping it the way he had, without counting, because he had taught us, too late for him, but not too late, that the saving is the thing, and the credit is nothing. I am an old man now, older than my uncle was when he died, and I have told this story to my children and my grandchildren, and now to you, because a man like Halvor Nagel is saved from oblivion only by the telling, and he saved too many to be let slip into it. People hear it, and they ask me why he never told anyone, why he bore the laughter all those years when the truth would have made him beloved, and I used to not have an answer. I have one now, worn smooth from turning it over my whole life. He did not tell because telling was not the point. He was not building a reputation. He was building a place to run to for a girl who never found one, and for strangers who would never know his name. And a man doing a thing purely for love and not at all for himself does not need anyone to know. The knowing would have added nothing to her, and she was the only one it was ever for. He hung her shawl by his door. He drove out into the storm that killed her, year after year, and he built against it. And he let us laugh, because our laughing cost the strangers on that hill nothing, and their lives were all he was after. I have never known a thing more quiet or more strong, and I followed his tracks and found it, and I have spent an old man's lifetime making sure you could hear about it. Now, this family is ours, but here is what is true. On the open northern prairie, the blizzard's deadliest victims were very often travelers caught between shelters, lost within a mile of safety in a whiteout, and frozen for want of any nearer refuge. And this happened again and again across the Dakotas, Minnesota, and Nebraska in the settlement years. The oldest wisdom against it was exactly the kind of thing in this story: waypoints and caches of wood and shelter placed along dangerous routes, rope lines and marked trails between house and barn, and stocked halfway houses on the long stretches, so that a person overtaken by a storm would have a third place to reach. Fire built in the lee of a hill or bank will live in a wind that would kill it in the open, and dry tinder kept sealed against the damp was the difference between life and death for anyone caught out. The people of Red Wing Township are imagined. The killing Prairie and the simple, patient, life-saving idea of putting shelter where people die so that they need not are exactly as they were.